Greetings to everyone, friends. The situation is becoming very alarming for all, absolutely all without exception, men of conscription age living in European Union countries. And in fact, 3 statements were made at the same time expressing the desire to deprive men of conscription age, citizens of Ukraine, of protection. And if possible, to encourage them to leave the territory of the EU so that they return to Ukraine and go to the front. A very interesting trend, but it's not as simple as it seems. These are not just populist statements, although that's partly true, because there are already concrete actions and specific draft laws that show they can tighten the screws. Well, maybe not right away, but this trend exists today. We will actually analyze all 3 statements, and we will also additionally discuss everything that is happening behind the scenes right now and what is not being talked about publicly. But it's very easy to track if you have the desire to do so. And let's actually get started. First of all, in the European Union, Ukrainian men may be deprived of the right to protection from the war. In my opinion, it's not entirely logical that many men subject to military service who do not have the right to leave Ukraine immediately receive temporary protection as soon as they cross the border. This was reported by the Special Representative for Ukrainian Affairs in the EU, Johansson. This is how she responded to a request about the protection of Ukrainians in the EU after March of 2027. That is, one of the options for extending the program is to exclude protection for men who are fit for military service. And it is reported that discussions are ongoing, but don't panic just yet because that's not all. And now we move on to the most interesting part. This particular statement was made, today, about 10 minutes ago, and today you'll already be watching this video. Subscribe to the channel as well, by the way. Don't forget to leave a like and write your opinion in the comments under this video. Now let's go through the specific statements. And first, a statement from the Czech Republic. Okamura, who is he anyway, and why should we read his words carefully but without panic? The leader of the Czech SPD movement, Tomio Okamura, stated that the Czech Republic is allegedly negotiating with the European Union about possibly ending temporary protection for Ukrainian men of conscription age. According to him, support from other EU countries is needed for this. First, who is Okamura? He is the leader of the far-right SPD party Freedom and Direct Democracy and the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies of the Czech Parliament. The party gets about 10 to 11% of the votes in elections. So Okamura builds his brand on anti-migration and anti-Ukrainian rhetoric. This is a very interesting point because Okamura himself is actually half Czech and half Japanese. He was born in Japan, then he lived in Japan until he was 6, then moved to the Czech Republic and then moved back to Japan again. And in both places he was bullied, and then he returned to the Czech Republic and started doing business. So in fact, a person who is himself a migrant is building anti-migration policy in the Czech Republic. This is a very interesting point, in my opinion. What do you think about this? Write in the comments. Importantly, he is not a member of the government, and the SPD party is actually in opposition to the current government. But this also doesn't bring much joy because the current government in the Czech Republic, in fact, uses, let's say, the same rhetoric. The Czech Republic cannot make such changes on its own because temporary protection is regulated by European legislation. The country's government has already initiated negotiations. Negotiations with other EU countries. Metnar discussed this issue with the German Minister of the Interior, Dobrindt. And this is Metnar, the Minister of the Interior of the Czech Republic. The parties agreed to start debates on adjusting the conditions. So, in fact, what Okamura said, who you don't really have to listen to, since he doesn't have real power, well, he said exactly what the Czech government is already doing. So this isn't very good news for Ukrainians living in Germany, those living in the Czech Republic, and for Ukrainians, by the way, who live in Poland. And basically the statement by Johansson, who wants, and we can see she is very actively trying, to deprive Ukrainian men of conscription age of protection in order to send them back to Ukraine to fight in the war. That doesn't add anything positive either. Let's move on. He advocates for the quickest possible end to temporary protection for all Ukrainians in the Czech Republic. And Okamura's arguments are just ironclad, in quotation marks, of course. There are too many Ukrainians here. Some of them supposedly travel to Ukraine regularly for vacations. And after the war ends, temporary protection will lose its meaning. After the war ends, of course, temporary protection will lose its meaning, but we see that things are developing a bit differently now. They are developing at a time when there is no end in sight to the war, and we see what's happening now. Exactly the same statements are being made by Johansson, the EU Special Representative for Ukrainian refugees, as well as in the Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany. That is, in the three countries where the largest number of Ukrainian refugees are currently located. And in fact, they are now considering the option of taking away temporary protection from men, even though the war is ongoing and even though it could threaten their lives if they return to Ukraine. That's how it is, you know? European double standards, as they say. And I always get the impression that they either have some secret agreements or they're just doing the math and seeing that in order for Ukraine to hold out for a few more years and for them to have time to prepare, they need to provide Ukraine with a manpower reserve. Next, what is actually behind these statements, Okamura's statements? The European Commission has officially confirmed that the decision on temporary protection applies equally to all Ukrainians, without making exceptions for men of conscription age. But we see that Johansson's latest statement also calls this state of affairs into question. Although right now there are, let's say, total bans for men of conscription age. In the territory of the EU, in fact, they are only being considered in 3 countries and are being promoted only by 3 countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Germany. All the other countries of the European Union, as we can see, don't care. For one simple reason, because fewer Ukrainians live in these countries and they have no desire to deport them anywhere, do anything with them, and so on. Because they do the math, they see how it all works out financially, they see that their shortage of workers is being covered, and it's good for their economies. In these countries as well, because they get extra profits from Ukrainians working on their territory, but again, the rhetoric continues. And in my opinion, this rhetoric is more for internal use, aimed at the domestic anti-Ukrainian audience rather than the external one. What is also very good for all Ukrainians in the EU is that negotiations about the possibility of ending protection for Ukrainian men are progressing with difficulty. Actually, Okamura himself said this in the same statement. He said that it's not so easy to achieve this. There are a lot of obstacles in European legislation and so on. So personally, I don't believe that this idea will be implemented, but such statements can be made. But again, this is just pandering to the radical anti-Ukrainian audience in order to win them over in the next parliamentary or presidential elections in one country or another. That's why this happens in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and in Germany. That is, in places where, in fact, Ukrainian citizens have become a political tool rather than a category of foreigners who should be protected. So, on the one hand, they say they're helping us out of humanitarian reasons, that they're doing such a great job, but on the other hand, they're using us. In fact, they use the category of Ukrainians to solve their own internal problems, to score political points, and they don't shy away from, let's say, the dirtiest manipulations. But again, it is what it is. Next, regarding Bibash's government in the Czech Republic, there's also an important point that could spread to all the countries of the European Union. In fact, Bibash came to power with anti-Ukrainian rhetoric. So he promised on his Facebook page to prepare and introduce changes to the LX Ukraine law by the end of May in order to stop the abuse of benefits by Ukrainians. Which ones? Those of you who live in the Czech Republic, write and tell me, have you ever abused benefits in your life, and how widespread is this phenomenon in the Czech Republic? What exactly are they planning to do? Officials are considering canceling some benefits for Ukrainians registering cars and requiring mandatory inspections for vehicles with Ukrainian plates, equalizing the rules for receiving social benefits with those that apply to Czech citizens, strengthening the verification of living and working conditions, in particular the presence of medical insurance and legal employment. Yes, legal employment. In fact, what does this mean for people? First of all, equalizing benefits with Czech standards means reduced support for most people. Although, again, there are plenty of jobs in the Czech Republic and most Ukrainians are working. And let's be honest, they should just stop claiming that they're helping so much and leave people alone. And people would just work, pay taxes, and they wouldn't have any more problems. But again, this is only possible when Ukrainians are no longer used as that part of society that everyone can blame and put all their mistakes on, accusing Ukraine and Ukrainians of everything. That's it. Next, second, vehicle inspection for cars with Ukrainian license plates, meaning a specific requirement, you will need to get your car inspected. And third, stricter checks, meaning more risks for those who work illegally or do not comply with the conditions of staying in the country. That's it. There's also important context here. Bibash reacted emotionally and called the media liars and started insisting that his government is not softening, but on the contrary, tightening the rules for Ukrainian stay. In fact, this is an attempt to defend himself against accusations of not fulfilling his pre-election promises. And the pre-election promises were much tougher, I would even say harsher, than what we have today. In fact, this statement of his is more aimed at the domestic audience, more intended to somehow get rid of the pressure from the ultra-right parties. Again, the same Okamura and so on. And trying to show the voters that he will have a tough stance and will give a hard time to all Ukrainians living in the Czech Republic. And by the way, officially ignoring the fact that the Czech Republic is making huge profits from the presence of Ukrainians on its territory, because the Czech Republic receives several times more money in the form of paid taxes than it spends on helping Ukrainians. So, in fact, as of today, the situation doesn't look like the Czech Republic is helping Ukrainians, but rather that Ukrainian refugees are helping the Czech economy grow and provide salaries, pensions, and other social and related expenses in this country. But again, neither Bibash nor Okamura will ever officially say a word about this in their lives, because they've gotten too caught up in this far-right game themselves. And now they don't know how to explain anything to people. That Ukrainians are much more beneficial for the Czech Republic than other refugees who come to them, yes, and other migrants who also come to them. But again, it seems to me that over time this will backfire on them. But again, time will tell. Next, the next one is Poland, right? We remember that in Poland, after March 4, 1926 temporary protection had effectively ended. And unlike in the Czech Republic, where changes are still being discussed, in Poland they have actually been in effect for several months already. Monthly payments of 800 are now tied to official employment or business. And for foreigners who are not officially employed, the 800 payments actually become unavailable. Full access to medical care will be available to minors, employed individuals, and residents of collective accommodation centers, which are also being reduced. And when people switch from UKR status to KUKR status, they will also be kicked out of these collective accommodation centers. Unemployed Ukrainians will receive medical care at the same level as other unemployed foreigners. That is, they can only call an ambulance, and basically, that's it. But again, I don't see any problem with this. The only issue is with vulnerable groups of the population, right? Those who can't take care of themselves. These are pensioners, people with certain illnesses, people with disabilities, minors, young children, pregnant women, families with many children, and so on. But again, we see that this problem already exists in Poland, but so far no one is addressing it. At the same time, the rhetoric in Poland, no matter how you look at it, the official rhetoric, is much softer than in the Czech Republic. Because, for example, the spokesperson for the Polish government explained that most Ukrainians currently living in Poland are already working, their children are studying in schools, so the state considers it possible to gradually lift the emergency regulations. And the official statement from Poland is simply that there is no longer any point in temporary protection. So, and in the Czech Republic, they say that they will fight against some abuses by Ukrainians. That is, in fact, they are unjustifiably portraying Ukrainians as some kind of criminals who are a burden on the Czechs, although that's absolutely not true. And most Ukrainians work, officially pay taxes, and support the Czech economy not only with their labor, but also with the money from paying taxes. But again, no one is going to talk about this. Next, Germany. There are also 1,200,000 Ukrainian refugees living in Germany. They are making social assistance payment rules stricter. Now, if you refuse a job offer through the job center, your payments can be completely cancelled. And the new rule came into effect on April 23, 2026. Those who arrived after April 1, 2025 will receive lower assistance, 441 euros instead of 563. If you fail to attend a consultation at the employment center, your assistance may be reduced by another 30%. The rhetoric in Germany, just like in Poland and the Czech Republic, is based on the idea that payments should be reduced and fewer benefits should be given to Ukrainians. And all men of conscription age should be deprived of protection so that they go to defend Ukraine, in fact, to defend Europe. But again, no one talks about this. And we even remember the statement by Friedrich Merz when Zelensky visited him about what Germany would do, including working on, together with Ukrainian security services, returning Ukrainian men of conscription age back home, so that they can be sent to the front. That's the story. And here is also a very interesting point. The thing is, migrants have started being brought into Ukraine. Indians have started to be brought in. And it turns out that Indians are being brought into Ukraine so that they can work, pay taxes, and simply provide for themselves and their families. And they want to bring Ukrainians back to Ukraine so that they can be sent straight to the front. That's the whole injustice, and the answer to the question of why Ukrainians will do everything not to return to Ukraine. Because it's not just about not being able to provide for your family in Ukraine, although that also matters. That's a good point. There are fears about returning. And here the issue is that Ukrainian men who return home are very likely to be sent to the front. But when Indians arrive, they are not threatened by this. That's the whole difference. In fact, what's happening now is systemic. It's not just a coincidence. And if you look at it, yes, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany are the three countries where the most Ukrainians live. They're all moving in the same direction together. Fewer special benefits, more conditions, more control, more pressure for integration, and more restrictions for men of conscription age. I'm not going to talk about benefits or free healthcare and so on. Let's be honest. If all of that were cancelled right now, just cancelled everything. If they only left the basics like legal stay in these countries and stopped with their constant accusations against Ukrainians, that would already be enough. Exactly. But we see that they always leave some nonsense, some little thing, so that later they can say that Ukrainians are a burden to them and that their countries are in such a situation because of those damned Ukrainians who are to blame for everything. That's the rhetoric now. It's only slightly visible officially. But if the situation continues, if the crisis in the European Union deepens economically, then it's likely that the cries blaming Ukrainians for everything will get louder in domestic arenas. Let's move on. What should we do in practice? If you simply live in any country of the European Union, definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any updates. There'll be about temporary protection after March 4th, 2027, because it's just until the end of May, and in fact we have only 12 days left. During this period, we were promised specifics about temporary protection. Next, if you live in the Czech Republic, Zbibash promised changes by the end of May 2026. Follow the news. If you are not working officially, this is actually the biggest risk. Check your status and the conditions for receiving payments. If you have a car with Ukrainian license plates, be prepared to have your vehicle inspected. I don't see any problems with this, but again, you need to be prepared. Moving on. If you live in Poland, we know that the rules have already changed since March 4, 2026. That's it. We won't stop at this, but again, we will. For the Czech Republic, there's only one piece of advice. Try to avoid any violations as much as possible, even minor ones, even improper parking, any conflicts, speeding, and so on. because anything you do in Poland can be interpreted by the Polish border guard as grounds for deporting you to Ukraine, under the pretext that your behavior threatens public order in Poland. This is currently one of the most common ways to deport Ukrainians back home. So we see that they don't hesitate to do this either, so be as careful as possible. If you already have any offenses, it's probably better to leave Poland altogether, so that you don't have to walk around, look over your shoulder, and wonder if someone will break down your door at 6 in the morning just to take you to the border guard station and deport you to Ukraine from there. But again, this applies to those who already have some violations and so on. Third, if you live in Germany, starting from April 23, if you refuse even once a job offer provided by the job center, your payments may be cancelled, your payments may be reduced, or your payments may even be cancelled completely. So also be careful and keep this in mind. The conclusion we can draw is that the rhetoric is really intensifying. And the closer we get to the decision about what should happen to Ukrainians after March 4, 2027, the more talk there is about it. Temporary protection needs to be extended, but it should be limited for men of conscription age. In fact, in reality, legally it is impossible to do this, let's say, across the entire European Union. Temporary protection should either be cancelled completely, and then for everyone, and then introduce some special statuses and not give these statuses to Ukrainian men of conscription age, or continue as it is, and then, let's be honest, nothing will happen to the men. No one will be able to do anything. They can use payments or extra conditions to pressure people, but again, they can't just take and extend temporary protection for everyone except men of conscription age. Because there are European conventions, European laws, and directives that directly prohibit discrimination based on gender, age, and in principle on any other grounds. So this won't happen, but again, there may be a lot of these conversations. Don't put too much stock in it. Save yourself the stress. If something more serious happens, I will definitely let you know in my new videos, so be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell under the video so you don't miss notifications about new videos. Remember, every day in both the first and second half of the day, fresh videos are released on my channel, so don't forget to check in and watch, even if you didn't get a notification. I wish you all a great day, friends, and see you next time.